welcome Third Church. It's good to have you back. Thanks for joining us for our next conversation around the book of Hebrews. Today we're going to be talking about Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 10. So let me go ahead and just get us started, and I'll read that for you now. So it says this: "Therefore, since the promise that we can enter into rest is still open, let's be careful so that none of you will appear to miss it. We also had the good news preached to us, just as the Israelites did. However, the message they heard didn't help them because they weren't united in faith with the ones who listened to it. We who have faith are entering the rest. As God said, 'And because of my anger I swore they will never enter my rest.' And yet God's works were completed at the foundation of the world. Then somewhere he said this about the seventh day of creation: God rested on the seventh day from all his works. But again, in the passage above, God said, 'They will never enter my rest.' Therefore, it's left open for some to enter it, and the ones who had the good news preached to them before didn't enter because of disobedience. Just as it says in the passage above, God designates a certain day as today, when he says through David much later, 'Today, if you hear his voice, don't have stubborn hearts.' If Joshua gave the Israelites rest, God wouldn't have spoken about another day later on. So you see that a Sabbath rest is left open for God's people. The one who entered God's rest also rested from his works, just as God rested from his own." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So recall, in the book of Hebrews, the central message is hold on. Do not give up. Again, remember that the author of Hebrews is writing to a Christian community that is suffering. Their faith is being tested, and they are considering whether or not it's worth it to continue to hold on in their faith, to continue to hold on to that which they believe. And they're also really wondering and wrestling with the question, is it possible that God's promises aren't exactly what we believe they might be? So there's suffering, there's a crisis of faith, and the author of the book of Hebrews is trying to write this pastoral word of encouragement. Say, hold on, don't lose faith. God is with you. So in the first couple of passages of scripture that we unpacked, the reason that the author of Hebrews gave to this Christian community why they should hold on is because in Jesus, God has sent us the uber prophet, the ultimate messenger, and the very expression of the being of God. Remember, the idea of holding on in faith starts and is centered around the person of Jesus. We see what God has done for us in Jesus. And Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection, his invitation to us to be his disciples and to follow him, that is for us a source of strength in our faith. And it is what allows us to hold on and to persevere when faith and life gets difficult. So in addition to some of these messages of hope and reasons to hold on, in our passage of scripture that we just read, the author of Hebrews adds another reason that he provides to this Christian community to hold on. And that is the idea of rest. In this passage of scripture, the author of Hebrews is speaking to this struggling Christian community, telling them to hold on in their faith because they are promised to be able to enter God's rest. And to do this, to make this argument, he references the Old Testament, in particular what's known as the wilderness generation, what we see in between Israel experiencing the Exodus under Moses' leadership, and then wandering in the wilderness for 40 years until Joshua comes and leads them into the promised land. So there is this comparison that the author of Hebrews is making to the wilderness generation. And again, the wilderness generation is significant because there was, for them in their wandering through the wilderness, a call towards obedience. It was a generation that was invited to trust God for their provision of all of their daily needs, and to trust that God would lead them into a better place and into a better future. So the call was towards obedience. It was a call against stubbornness, or what we read in the scriptures, a call against hardness of heart. The people of God in the wilderness were called to open their hearts, to be softened to the reality of God's presence, to lead them and to provide for them. So this wilderness generation, they experienced hardship. They experienced suffering. They too wondered if God would be present with them. They also wondered, perhaps, maybe did God lie to them? Are they truly better off as they're wandering through the wilderness now? Or were they better off in Egypt when they were enslaved? They were promised God's presence. They were promised God's strength. They were promised God's rest. But ultimately, the wilderness generation, despite all of those promises, they failed to trust in God's presence and power. The wilderness generation failed to enter into God's rest in the promised land. And that gift, that promise, fell to the next generation. All right, let's stop there. That gives us a little bit to think about until it's time for us to come back together and consider additional texts from the book of Hebrews. Looking forward to being with you next time.